The house at Renmore stood at the top of a lane that had forgotten who first cut it, and it stood the way certain old houses do, as if it had come to an agreement with the weather and no longer expected either side to keep the terms. Its stones were the color of a river in November. Its windows had that faintly injured look of long-closed rooms recently reopened, and on the morning this story begins, a black traveling coach turned in at the far gate, and a woman in a plain gray gown stood upon the servant's step, and a bell was rung for the second time in an hour, and no one in the countryside could yet have told you which of these three small events would matter most, though the narrator will tell you now, plainly, that all three were the same event, and that everything which came after began before any of them, in a promise made 12 years earlier by a man who has since forgotten he made it. Look then at the woman on the step. She is called Marina Holloway, though at Renmore she will be called only Holloway, in the manner in which servants are called by the half of their names that costs the least breath. She is 29. She carries a small trunk with the handle mended twice. She has walked the last 3 miles because the driver would not take the lane in the wet, and she has walked them without complaint, for complaint was among the first economies she was taught. And if you had asked her, in that moment on the step, what she hoped for from the house behind the great door, she would have answered you honestly, which is to say she would have answered you wrong. She would have said a place, and a wage, and a room that did not leak, when in truth what she was there to receive was a child's hand slipped into hers at a long table, and the end of a grief she had not yet been told she carried. She did not know this. She would not know it for some weeks. That is the way of such arrivals. The housekeeper, a spare woman named Mrs. Ordway, who wore her keys the way a soldier wears a sword, opened the door and looked at her once, from cap to hem, and said, "You are late by an hour." And Marina said, "I walked the lane." And Mrs. Ordway heard in that answer everything she needed to know of the new servant's pride, and everything she needed to know of the new servant's purse, and she said, "Come in then, and mind the step. It is loose." It was loose. It had been loose for 6 years. It would be loose for 6 more, and would eventually be mended, in the last chapter of this story, by hands neither woman could yet have guessed at. But this is running ahead, which the narrator will do freely when the tale asks it, and will atone for by taking you back into the small rooms of Renmore patiently, one by one, so that you may understand not only who lived in them, but who was afraid in them. And why? For the great grief of Renmore, and the great grief of its master, was a thing not spoken of aloud in the house, and if you had asked any of the 22 persons in its service what had happened 5 winters before, they would each have found some polite piece of work to attend to, and would each have answered you, in their own way, that it was not their place to say. It was not their place, but it is ours. 5 winters before, on a night of hard frost, a young duchess of 26 had died in an upstairs room of this house, of a fever that came in with the guests at a christening and stayed after the guests had gone. She had left behind a husband who did not weep in public, and a daughter of 2 who did not yet know the word mother, and a room whose door was thereafter closed, and whose fire was thereafter not lit. And the master of Renmore, whose name was Ashton Verrell, Duke of Kilbrace, 31 at the time of that closing door, 36 at the opening of this tale, had said to his mother on the night after the funeral, "I shall not marry again." And his mother, who was the Dowager Lady Kilbrace, and who was formidable in the exact old sense of the word, meaning that she inspired dread in those who loved her, had said, "You will when the time is proper," and had said nothing more, for she had learned in 50 years of managing men that the shortest sentence carries the furthest. 5 years had passed. The time, in the dowager's judgment, had become proper. And that was the second event of the morning at Renmore, though it had begun the evening before, in a letter carried by a boy on a gray pony, folded twice and sealed once, in which the Dowager Lady Kilbrace informed her son that she would arrive at his house on Thursday next with 3 young ladies of good family and unblemished reputation, from among whom he would choose, or from among whom she would choose, and that the matter was to be settled before the harvest ball at Marchmount 6 weeks hence, at which the county would expect an announcement, and would have one. The Duke read this letter in his study at 8 in the morning, and he did not throw it into the fire, though he considered it, and he did not answer it, though he considered that too. And instead he laid it flat upon his blotter, and set his ink stand upon its lower edge to hold it down, as one holds down a summons one intends to obey without pretending to welcome. It was not that he wished to defy his mother. He had never quite dared to do so, and had learned in his boyhood that her love ran along the same iron rail as her will, and that to leave the rail was to leave the love, and he was not a man who could bear the loss of a second person he was fond of. It was rather that he wished, once, before he was fitted for the harness a second time, to say aloud to himself the thing he had not said in 5 years, which was that he had loved his wife well enough to be broken by her death, and had loved her badly enough to be relieved. In some small, dishonorable corner of himself, when she was gone, for she had been quick and clever and impatient with him, and he had felt himself, all the years of that marriage, a slow horse harnessed to a swift one. And he had loved her. Both things were true, and they cost him, together, more than either would have cost alone. He rose from the desk, he walked to the window, he looked down into the courtyard, where a woman in a gray gown was following Mrs. Ordway across the flags with a mended trunk in her hand, and he did not know her name, and he did not remark her, for one does not remark the servants unless they break something, and this one, walking behind his housekeeper in the light rain, looked as though she had never broken anything in her life. He turned from the window. He went to find his daughter. The third event of the morning was the ringing of the bell for the second time in an hour, and it was rung by master of the house upon the small silver plate outside the nursery, which was the private code by which he asked, without asking, whether Miss Cordelia Varell, 7 years and 4 months old, was awake and dressed and willing to receive her father. She was awake. She was dressed. She was willing. She was, in fact, standing behind the door with both her small hands clasped in front of her in a way she had learned from watching her grandmother, and when he entered she said, "Good morning, father." And he said, "Good morning, Cordelia." And neither of them, in that exchange, said anything they meant, for they had not yet, in 7 years and 4 months, learned how. And it was because they had not yet learned how that this whole story was necessary, and that a woman in a gray gown had walked 3 miles in the rain to arrive at a step that was loose, and that a letter under an inkstand would open a door that had been closed since a winter of hard frost, and that a child would, within a fortnight, slip her hand into a stranger's fingers at a long table and refuse, all evening, to let go. Understand this, before we go on. The Duke of Kilbrace did not know he was lonely. He knew he was tired. He knew his accounts were in a strange state that his steward could not quite explain, and that a certain figure in a certain column had been wrong 3 quarters in a row, and that his steward, whose name was Mr. Prine, and who had served the family for 31 years, had begun to look, at the mention of the ledgers, as though a cold draught had passed him in a shut room. He knew that his mother would arrive on Thursday. He knew that his daughter was afraid of horses and hid it, and that he was afraid of his daughter and hid it, and that between them stood 5 years of a door that had not opened. He did not know he was lonely. That is what other people were for. To take you now, if you will, into the kitchen at Renmore at 10:30 on that first morning is to take you into a room whose fire was the honest engine of the house, and whose long deal table bore, at that hour, the day's second baking of loaves, and a basin of new butter, and a folded cloth, and, at its farther end, a small sharp knife with which Mrs. Ordway was dividing the household duties as one divides bread. She had, before her, the new servant, Marina Holloway, in the gray gown, and behind Marina, invisible to Marina and visible to the housekeeper, the cook, Mrs. Fenn, who had raised the master from a boy of 6, and who allowed herself, in her own kitchen, opinions no other servant would have dared. "Mrs. Ordway said, you will wait at the great table on formal evenings, and you will attend the young lady when nurse is at chapel, and you will keep the linen for the schoolroom, and you will not speak to the master unless spoken to. And you will curtsy to the dowager when she comes on Thursday." And Marina said, "Yes, Mrs. Ordway and Mrs. Fenn said, "From behind she will do," which was, in that kitchen, the highest commendation a stranger had received in 5 years, and Mrs. Ordway pretended not to hear it, and Marina pretended not to hear it too, but she felt in her chest, for the first time since she had stepped from the coach, a small unfamiliar heat, and she named it wrongly, in her own mind, as relief when what it was, in fact, was the beginning of belonging. She did not know she was lonely either. That was the great symmetry of the house she had entered. None of the persons who mattered to this story yet knew what they lacked, and each of them, going about their careful work, believed themselves whole. It is the narrator's business to know better, and to tell you so. On the 3rd morning of Marina's service, she was sent to the schoolroom with a tray, because Nurse Beeching had a swollen ankle, and had been told by Mrs. Ordway to sit, which was a command Nurse Beeching had not obeyed in 40 years, and did not intend to obey now, but she permitted the tray to go up in another woman's hands, and she permitted Marina to be the woman. Because Mrs. Fenn had said, "She will do," and Mrs. Fenn's judgments were, in that kitchen, taken as law. The schoolroom at Renmore was a long, low, north-facing room, with a globe upon a stand and a map of the world upon a wall, and a fire that smoked in an east wind, and in it, on a small stool by that fire, sat Miss Cordelia Varell, in a dark blue dress with a white collar, with her feet not quite reaching the floor, and her hands folded in her lap in the way she had learned from her grandmother's portrait, which hung in the long gallery, and which she had studied more often than any child of 7 ought to have studied any portrait. She did not turn her head when the door opened. She had been taught not to. Marina set the tray upon the low table by the window. She looked at the child, and the child did not look at her, and Marina, who had grown up in a schoolroom of her own and had lost it at 12, saw in that motionless smallback everything she needed to know, and did not name it either dignity or fear, though it was both, but only knelt down at a courteous distance and said, "Miss Cordelia, your bread and milk, and there is honey today, if you like it." The child said, without turning, "Thank you." Marina said, "Shall I set it here, or shall I set it by the fire?" The child said, "By the fire, if you please." Marina moved the tray to the low stool at the hearth, and she did not linger, and she did not speak again, and she did not, above all, look at the child as if the child were a small piece of grief, and it was because of these 3 restraints, and not because of any charm, that when Marina reached the door the child said, in a very small voice, "What is your name?" Marina said, "Holloway, Miss." The child said, "Your other name?" Marina said, "Marina." The child said, "Nothing at all," for a moment, and then said, "Thank you, Marina," and turned her face at last, and Marina saw, before she closed the door, that the child had her father's eyes, though she had not yet met her father to know it, and that in those eyes was a wariness which no child of 7 ought to have earned, and which some person in that house had failed over 5 long years to disarm. She went down the back stairs. She said nothing of the exchange to Mrs. Ordway, who would have called it forward, nor to Mrs. Fenn, who would have called it a mercy. She was not yet certain herself which of the two it had been. But that afternoon, when she was called up again with a fresh cloth, the child was standing at the window and did not turn, and said, without preamble, "Marina, is it true that my grandmother is coming on Thursday?" Marina said, "So I have heard, miss," the child said. "She does not like me." Marina, who had been in the house 60 hours and knew nothing, and who might have said any of 100 polite untrue things and been forgiven, said instead, "She may not know you well enough yet, miss," which was neither a lie nor a comfort, and the child considered this for the length of 3 breaths, and then said, quite plainly, "Neither does my father," and turned from the window and sat down at her books, and did not speak again for the rest of the hour. Marina went back to the kitchen and stood at the scullery sink for some minutes with her hands in cold water, and she was not weeping, for she had learned at 12 not to weep on a working day. But she was, in the small private country behind her eyes, adding to a ledger she had been keeping since she was a girl, in which were entered all the children she had met who had been left too long alone in warm houses, and she wrote in that ledger, that afternoon, the name Cordelia Varell, and she wrote beside it, in the shorthand of her mind, the single word watch. She did not know that the master of the house had, in the same hour, stood outside the schoolroom door for the space of 30 seconds, and had heard the child's small voice say, "Neither does my father," and had walked away down the corridor with his hand upon the wall, as a man walks who has been struck without warning by a piece of news he had already known. He did not go back. He did not, that evening, ask Nurse Beeching, who had been in the schoolroom in her stead. He asked, instead, at supper, in a voice as flat as the voice he kept for facts, who the new woman was in the grey gown, and Mrs. Ordway, who was passing the door, said, "Holloway, your grace, she was hired by the letter your steward sent to Cold Harbor last month." And the Duke said, "Ah," and said no more, and did not know, and could not yet have been told, that his steward had not, in fact, sent any letter to Cold Harbor, and that Marina Holloway had come to Renmore upon the private arrangement of Mrs. Fenn the cook, who had known Marina's mother in girlhood, and who had, upon receiving a letter herself from a friend in the town of Cold Harbor, decided that this was a girl who would suit, and had said so to Mrs. Ordway, and had let the two of them present the matter to the master as though it were routine, because Mrs. Fenn at 63 had come to believe that Providence sometimes required a nudge, and was not shy of giving one. The narrator will pause here, only for a moment, to tell you plainly, so that you may hold it in your mind as we go. The letter was not from Cold Harbor, and there was no such letter, and this fact will matter, and will be explained when the moment is right. Thursday came in with a low sky and a cold wind out of the east, which was the wind that smoked the schoolroom fire, and the Dowager Lady Kilbrace arrived at 3 in the afternoon in a coach so black that it seemed to draw the light from the wet gravel, and she descended upon the steps of Renmore as she had descended upon everything in her life, which was to say without apology and slightly ahead of time, and behind her came 3 young women in 3 different shades of pale, and behind them a maid apiece, and behind them a small quantity of luggage, and behind the luggage a silence, which the dowager preferred to be maintained in her presence, and which, in her presence, generally was. She was 66. She was tall. She wore black, as she had worn since a husband dead 19 years before, and she wore it not out of grief, which she had finished with promptly, but out of thrift and habit, and because she had discovered, in the intervening decades, that black frightened people, and that being frightening was a useful economy of speech. She kissed her son upon the cheek. She said, "Ashton," and he said, "Mother." And she said, "You are thin," and he said, "I am well." And she said, "We shall dine at 7." And she went upstairs to the rooms that had been prepared for her, which were the same rooms she had occupied when she was mistress of this house, and which had been kept in her absence exactly as she had left them, because no one, not even her son, had ever quite dared to alter a curtain she had chosen. Downstairs, in the servants' passage, Mrs. Ordway was distributing the 3 visiting maids among the 3 visiting rooms, and Marina was carrying a jug of hot water up the back stairs, and Mrs. Fenn was cutting the tops from 6 pheasants with a very sharp knife. And in the schoolroom, the child Cordelia was sitting at the window, in her second-best dress, watching the coaches unhook in the yard, and not asking whom they had brought, because she had already been told, and had already decided, without any of the words a child of 7 possesses for such decisions, that she would look at the ladies once, and would not look again. She was mistaken in this. She would look again, before the evening was out. She would look, in fact, at a woman none of the ladies knew was in the room, and she would keep looking, and she would slip down from her chair, in the great dining room, on the occasion of the 4th remove, and she would cross the boards at the wall in her small shoes, and she would come to stand beside the woman in the gray gown who was pouring water at the far end of the sideboard, and she would put her small hand into the fingers of that woman, and would not, all evening, let it go. But this is running ahead. That evening was still 4 hours away. And in the 4 hours between, several small things happened at Renmore which the narrator will lay before you now in order, not because any one of them is the story, but because together they are the ground upon which the story stood. Mrs. Ordway went to the linen cupboard and counted the napkins twice, because the dowager could measure a household by the state of its linen, and had done so, in her own house, for 50 years. Mr. Prine the steward came down from his office with a folded paper in his hand, and stood for the space of a minute outside the door of the study before he knocked, and when he was called in, he laid the paper upon the desk with a hand that was not quite steady, and said, "The quarters totals, your grace. I have brought them a little late." And the Duke said, "Thank you, Prine. Leave them. I shall look at them tonight." And Mr. Prine went out again, and stood in the corridor with his hand upon the paneling, and swallowed. In the schoolroom, Nurse Beeching, who had put on her chapel dress, said to Cordelia, "You will come down when the bell rings, and you will curtsy to your grandmother, and you will say only what you are asked." And Cordelia said, "Yes." Nurse and Nurse Beeching added, in a lower voice, "And do not, whatever you do, look at your father's plate when he is not eating." And Cordelia said, "No, Nurse." And Nurse Beeching went out, and did not know she had said the second thing aloud, and would have been mortified to know it, because Nurse Beeching, who was 60 and had raised a duchess and now a duke's daughter, loved this child in a manner she would not have called love, and had trained herself over long years in the smaller kindnesses one can give a child whose father cannot yet look at her without seeing the face of her mother. And in the great dining room, Marina Holloway was being instructed by the butler, Mr. Cleeve, in the exact order of the removes, and in the exact courtesy of the water jug, which was to be offered, he said, without a sound, and refused, if refused, without offense. And Marina, who had been taught these things at 12 by her own mother in her own father's house before it was lost, listened without expression, and answered, "Yes, Misty, Cleeve," and did not say, "I know this," for she had learned that the price of a place was the daily agreement to be told what one already knew. She would take, That evening, the water jugged down the far side of the long table, and she would stand at the sideboard with her back to the room during the speeches, and she would not, until the fourth remove, be looked at by any person in the room except one, and that one would be a child, and that child would look at her from the moment she entered, and would keep looking, and would, in the end, cross the boards to her. We will take a very short break here. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe so you will not miss what happens next. There is a way of understanding what a person is worth, and the narrator will offer it to you now, so that you may hold it as a lantern through the rooms to come. Watch how they behave to those who can do nothing for them. Watch how they speak to the woman pouring the water. Watch how they sit at the table when a child crosses the floor. Watch, above all, what they choose to do in the space of the 4 seconds after a small hand is laid in theirs without warning. Everything that a person is in those 4 seconds. And on the evening of the Dowager's arrival at Renmore, the narrator can tell you that in that room, at that table, there were 9 persons, and that of the 9. Only 3 would use those 4 seconds well. The child, who did not know it was a test, the woman in the gray gown, who had been given tests all her life and had ceased to be afraid of them, and the man at the head of the table, who was looking, at that moment, at his daughter's face, and seeing there, for the first time in 5 years, something he had believed was gone from the house. He would not, that night, name what he saw. He would name it a fortnight later, in the schoolroom at 8 in the evening, when he came in without knocking and found Marina Holloway kneeling by the low chair, with a book of colored maps open on the floor, and his daughter's small hand upon her arm, and he would say, quietly, as if he were laying down a wager he did not intend to lose, "Miss Holloway, will you sit at Cordelia's lessons henceforth in the afternoons?" And Marina would rise, and would curtsy, and would say, "If it is your Grace's wish," and the Duke would say, "It is my wish," and would go out, and would stand in the corridor with his hand upon the wall for the second time in a fortnight, and would understand, in that corridor, that a decision had been taken which he had not, strictly speaking, been consulted upon, and that he had, all the same, no wish to reverse it. But this is running ahead once more. Return, then, to the dining room. The candles were lit at 10 minutes to 7. The Dowager came down at 5 minutes to 7, which was her way, and the 3 young ladies came down at 7 precisely, and were led to their places by the butler. And the Duke came down last, which was his house's way, and offered his arm to his mother, and led her to the head of the table, and took the chair at her right, and the 3 young ladies took the 3 chairs opposite, and the Duke's daughter, Miss Cordelia Varell, aged 7 years and 4 months, was led in by Nurse Beeching at 4 minutes past 7, and set at the foot, upon a chair with 2 cushions, which raised her to the level of the table, and the Dowager looked once down the length of the boards at her granddaughter, and Cordelia curtsied where she sat in the small formal way she had rehearsed, and the Dowager inclined her head 1 exact inch, which was the courtesy she reserved for children she had not yet decided about, and the meal began. The 3 young ladies were called Miss Amabel Lord, Miss Isolde Vench, and Miss Priscilla Marne. They had been chosen, the Dowager said in a low voice to her son during the first remove, upon 3 principles: fortune, family, and forbearance, which was her word for the willingness to bear him without complaint. Miss Amabel Lord was very pretty, and knew it. Miss Isolde Vench was very rich, and knew it. Miss Priscilla Marne was very good, and did not know it, and it was for this last reason that the Dowager, in her private mind, had ranked her 3rd, for the Dowager had lived long enough to distrust goodness that did not know itself, on the grounds that it could not be relied upon to defend itself in a drawing-room. The Duke replied to none of this. He ate his soup. He answered the ladies when they were addressed to him. He said to Miss Lord that the roads had been kind to her, and to Miss Vench that her father's health, he trusted, continued fair, and to Miss Marne, who had said nothing, that the fire smoked in an east wind, and he begged her pardon for it. And Miss Marne, who had a small clear voice, said, "It does not trouble me, your grace, thank you," and looked once at him and once at her plate, and did not look at him again, which the dowager, watching, marked in her ledger as a point in the girl's favor. Marina Holloway stood at the sideboard with the water jug. She did not look at the table. She looked at the tray. She looked at the cloth. She looked at the small, dark stain upon the boards where, 3 winters ago, a boy had dropped a decanter and had been forgiven by the housekeeper on account of the shock. She did not look at the Duke. She had not, in a fortnight of service, seen him closer than the courtyard, and she had no wish to see him closer now, for she had learned long ago that the safest attitude to a master was invisibility, and she was practiced in it. It was the child who broke the invisibility. It happened, as such things happen, in a moment for which no one was ready. Between the 3rd remove and the 4th, in the small unattended space when the plates were being changed, and the ladies were speaking of a mutual cousin in the north, Cordelia Varell slid from her double cushion without a sound, and stood upon the boards in her small shoes, and walked, very slowly, and very straight, the length of the room, along the wall side, past the sideboard, past the fire, past the tall clock, and stopped beside the woman in the gray gown, who was standing at the far end of the sideboard with the jug in her hand, and put up her small right hand, and took, very deliberately, the 2 nearest fingers of Marina Holloway's left hand into her own, and closed her small fist upon them, and stood there, and did not move. Marina did not move either. She had, in the first half-second, the trained servant's instinct to bend and gently return the child, and she suppressed it. She had, in the second half-second, the woman's instinct to look at the head of the table for permission, and she suppressed that. She had, in the third half-second, the instinct simply to close her hand around the child's small hand, and this instinct she obeyed, and did so, and the fourth half-second passed, and by then the room had noticed. The dowager saw first. She had eyes trained for such small disorders, and she said, in a voice pitched to travel the length of the boards without appearing to, "Cordelia, my dear, come and sit down." Cordelia did not answer, and did not move, and did not release Marina's fingers. The dowager said, more quietly, "Cordelia." Cordelia looked at her grandmother, once, from the far end of the room, with the calm, considered look of a child who has decided a thing and does not intend to be moved from it, and said, in a voice that was not loud but was very clear, "I am staying here." There was a silence. It lasted, the narrator will tell you plainly, the space of 8 seconds, in which no fork moved and no plate was set down, and in which each of the persons at the table did what they were capable of doing, and no more. Miss Amabel Lord smiled a fixed small smile, which was the face she had been trained to make when a child said something disobliging. Mrs. Soldy Vench looked at her plate and turned a ring upon her finger once, and looked at her plate again. Miss Priscilla Marne looked up, once, at the child, and her face did a thing that would matter later. It softened, at once, and without calculation, which the dowager, watching, marked, and which the duke, watching harder, also marked. The dowager said, in the same traveling voice, "Cordelia, that is your grandmother's serving woman." "Come," Cordelia said, "she is not. She is Marina." Nurse Beeching, at the foot of the table, half rose from her chair with her hand upon her cane, and would have gone to fetch the child, and did not, because at that moment the Duke of Kilbrace lifted his own hand 2 inches from the cloth, and Nurse Beeching, who had known that hand since it was 6 years old, sat down again and said nothing. The Duke was looking at his daughter. He was looking at her as he had not looked at her, the narrator will say plainly, in 5 years since the winter of the closed door. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a lantern that has been lit in a room he had believed shut up for the season. And he was looking, without appearing to, at the woman whose fingers his daughter had taken, and he was seeing her. For the first time. As one sees a person and not a servant, which is to say he was seeing that she had not moved, and had not smiled, and had not bent to correct the child, and had not looked to him for instruction, and had not looked to his mother either, and had simply stood, with the jug in her right hand and the child's fingers in her left, at the exact courteous distance a good servant keeps from a table she is attending, and had waited, without expression, for the room to decide what it wished. This, in the Duke's private mind, was more courtesy than had entered his house in 5 years. He said, at last, from his end of the table, and in the flat voice he kept for facts, "Let her stand there, if she wishes." Nurse Beeching sat. The dowager set down her fork with a small, precise click that carried the weight of a longer sentence, and said, "Ashton." And the Duke said, "Mother, let her stand." And Cordelia stood, and Marina stood, and the meal went on, and the 4 ladies at the head of the table were served their 4th remove, and their 5th, and their 6th, and Cordelia did not eat, and Marina did not sit, and neither of them, for the whole of the evening, unclasped the small joined hand. The dowager, being a woman of the world, permitted this without further remark, and directed the conversation, with the skill of 40 years' practice, into channels that pretended nothing had occurred. She spoke of the harvest ball at Marchmount, 6 weeks hence, and of the road works upon the North Lane, and of a cousin's engagement in the East, and Miss Vench answered upon the ball, and Miss Lord answered upon the engagement, and Miss Marne answered upon the road works, having, alone of the 3, taken the trouble to notice them upon the way. And the Duke answered, when addressed, and did not answer when not, and looked, once every few minutes, down the length of the boards to the small figure at the sideboard, and looked, once every few minutes, at his mother, and said, in his own private mind, and without yet knowing that he had said it, that whatever list his mother had made, and whatever ball the county expected, and whatever announcement was to be given at Marchmount 6 weeks hence, he had, by the 8th remove, already made up his mind. He did not know he had made up his mind. He would not admit it, even to himself, for another 11 days. He would tell himself, in the interval, that he was only observing, that he was only being patient, that he was only allowing his daughter a small, unusual friendship with a woman who had been kind to her in the schoolroom, that he was only interested, as any master must be, in the character of a new servant in his house, and he would tell himself all these things sincerely, and would believe them at the moment of telling, in the way that a man of 36, wounded, careful, and long unpracticed in the naming of his own feelings, believes the things he tells himself. But the narrator will tell you plainly, for you are entitled to know it now, he had made up his mind at the 4th remove, when a child crossed the boards, and a woman did not move. When the ladies rose, at last, and went into the drawing-room for tea, and Cordelia was led away by Nurse Beeching, and Marina was left to clear the sideboard. The Duke lingered a moment in the dining-room upon the pretext of examining a decanter that did not need examining, and he said, without looking at Marina, Miss Holloway. Marina, who had begun to lift the jug, set it down again, and turned, and curtsied, and said, "Your Grace." He said, still without looking at her, "I thank you for your kindness to my daughter." Marina said, "She was kind to me, Your Grace." He looked at her then. He did not know until he had looked that he had not looked at her before. He saw a woman of 29 in a gray gown with a mended collar, whose eyes were the color of river water in shadow, and whose hands, folded before her, were the hands of a woman who had worked and who had not lost the habit of holding herself as if she had not needed to. He said, "Good night, Miss Holloway." She said, "Good night, Your Grace." He went out. She stood a moment. She looked at the jug. She looked at the small dark stain upon the boards. She lifted the jug, and she carried it, and she said nothing to Mrs. Fenn in the kitchen, and Mrs. Fenn said nothing to her, and Mrs. Fenn only, when Marina had gone up the back stairs with a candle, turned to Mrs. Ordway at the deal table and said, in a voice pitched for one hearer only, "It has begun, then, and Mrs. Ordway, who had heard from Mr. Cleeve the butler in the passage what had passed at the fourth remove, said, "It has," and neither woman spoke of it again that night, for in a household as old as Renmore, some things are known long before they are said, and some things are said only when it is safe to say them, and this was neither. Upstairs, in a room at the end of the west corridor, the Dowager Lady Kilbrace sat before her glass and unclasped from her throat a small dark pearl, and did not immediately lay it upon the tray, but held it, and looked at it, and considered, in her private mind, the events of the evening, and named to herself, quite plainly, that her son had looked twice down the length of the boards at a serving woman, and had, at the 8th remove, ceased to look at any of the 3 ladies she had brought. She did not name it a defeat. She was too old to name a first move a defeat. But she named it a warning, and she named the warning by its right degree, and she said aloud, "To no one we shall see," and laid the pearl upon the tray, and rose, and went to bed. And downstairs, in the study, the Duke of Kilbrace sat with the folded quarters totals under his hand, and did not open them, and looked instead at the fire, and thought, without permitting himself to know he was thinking it, of the 4 seconds in which a child had stood by a sideboard and a woman had not moved, and understood, for the first time in 5 years, that the closed room upstairs was not the only closed room in his house, and that some doors, when they are opened by a small hand one does not see coming. 6 weeks, the narrator will remind you, until Marchmount. 6 weeks, in which a mother would present her list a second time, and a son would decline it a second time, and a steward would fail to explain a figure in a column for the 4th quarter running, and a child would learn to laugh again in a schoolroom that smoked in an east wind, and a woman in a gray gown would sit at afternoon lessons and hold a small hand under the table, and a house would begin, without announcing it, to warm. In the 11 days that followed the dinner, the arrangement of the house at Renmore altered in the manner in which such houses do alter, which is to say, without any single order being given, and by the small daily adjustments of many persons, each pretending that they had adjusted nothing. Nurse Beeching's swollen ankle continued to trouble her in a manner that was noticed by Mrs. Ordway to be somewhat regulated by the events of the schoolroom. It was worse on the mornings when Marina was needed at the linen, and better on the afternoons when she was free to sit with the child. Mrs. Fenn, in the kitchen, contrived that the tray for the schoolroom should require, twice a day, a second hand to carry it, and the second hand was always Marina's. Mr. Cleeve the butler, unbidden, sat at Cordelia's place in the small parlor where she took her supper a second cup and a second plate, and did not say for whom, and Marina, arriving upon the child's summons at the appointed hour, ate her bread and drank her milk beside her charge, and did not remark upon the 2 cups either, and the Duke of Kilbrace, passing the parlor door upon 2 occasions, heard from within the sound of a child's laughter, which was a sound that had not been heard in that house since the winter of the closed door, and did not go in, and did not, at supper, mention what he had heard. He was, in that fortnight, examining himself as a man examines a wound he has not looked at for some years, in order to determine whether it will still bear pressure. He found that it would. He found that it would bear more pressure than he had believed. He found that the pressure was being applied, not by any grand event, but by the small daily circumstance of a woman in a gray gown reading maps aloud to his daughter in the schoolroom in the afternoon. And he found that the pressure was, contrary to every expectation he had held for 5 years, a relief. He said none of this aloud. He would not have known how. He went, instead, on the 12th evening, into the schoolroom without knocking, at 8 o'clock, and found what the narrator has already told you he would find: Marina Holloway kneeling by the low chair with a book of colored maps open upon the floor, and his daughter's small hand upon her arm, and a fire burning honestly against the east wind, and the room. For the first time in his memory of it, warm, and he said, "Quietly, Miss Holloway, will you sit at Cordelia's lessons henceforth in the afternoons?" And Marina rose, and curtsied, and said, "If it is your Grace's wish." And the Duke said, "It is my wish." And Cordelia, at his elbow, said, without looking at him, "Yes, father," which was the first yes. Father, his daughter had spoken to him in 5 years that was not the answer to a summons, and he heard it, and he did not turn to her, for he could not trust his face, and he only said, again, "Good night," and went out. In the corridor he stood with his hand upon the wall. He was 36. He had been a widower 5 years. He had believed himself, 5 years, incapable of the thing he was now doing, which was, he understood at last, and named plainly to himself for the first time in the dark passage, that he was choosing. He had chosen. He had, in fact, chosen at the 4th remove of a dinner 11 days earlier, in the 4 seconds during which a woman had not moved, and he had been catching up with his own choice ever since. He went down to the study. He sat at the desk. He drew the folded quarters totals toward him, at last, and opened them. And in the 3rd column, at the 4th entry from the bottom, in the neat, regular hand of Mr. Prine the steward, who had served the family 31 years, he saw a figure which did not agree with the figure above it by the sum of £140, which was neither a great sum nor a small one, but which was the 4th such disagreement in 4 consecutive quarters, and which had begun, he now saw, plainly, in the quarter after the death of his wife. He sat with the paper in his hand for a long time. He did not raise his voice. He did not ring the bell. He folded the paper again and laid it under the inkstand upon the letter from his mother, which was still there, and he thought, without permitting himself yet to think it fully, that there were in his house 2 closed rooms he had left too long unopened, and that he had begun, at last, to open them both, and that the opening of one had somehow made possible the opening of the other, in the way of houses and of hearts, when at last a stranger walks in at the door. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and what this story made you feel. And do not forget to subscribe, so you will not miss the next story.